great to see many of you again. Many of you I haven't seen for 2 years, longer than 2 years, so this is a great opportunity to reconvene and talk about this great subject, which I myself am very interested in, and I have been following the Pacific Alliance for quite some time. I want to acknowledge all our guests from government. We have diplomats, of course, representatives from the 4 countries of the Pacific Alliance. Welcome, it's great to see you. And we also have guests from academia, from the business sector, from civil society, and I think I saw some representatives from universities as well. So it's great to see you all. Thank you. And I have to say, I was very excited to do this today when the Embassy of Mexico kindly asked me to moderate this panel, this great discussion. As I said, I'm very interested in the Pacific Alliance. My background is in trade policy, so of course I've been involved in this project for quite some time. And in my current role, I work at Scotiabank. I am part of the communications team in our international banking group. So I work with the Pacific Alliance every day, all the time. So this is a subject that's very dear to my heart. And I want to introduce our panelists here today. Thank you so much for your time, for sharing your thoughts. Meredith Lilly, who is Associate Director of the Master's Program at the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs at Carleton U. So that's my university, so it's great to see you. That's a great connection. And Pablo Evrich, who is an international political economist at Carleton U as well, associate professor. So welcome. Now, by way of introduction, I think many of you already know this, but Pacific Alliance is made up of 4 countries. It is Mexico, Chile, Colombia, and Peru. And whenever I talk about the Pacific Alliance, I always say, this is much more than a trade agreement. I think that there is this idea that it's another trade agreement in the vast network of trade agreements that exists in Latin America or the Americas. But I always say this is about a project of integration. And I think, the Pacific Alliance over time has seen many successes beyond trade. I think that there's a lot of connectivity, there's a lot of projects in academic exchange or regulatory cooperation, dialogue at multiple layers of government. And I think that might have been part of the secret sauce of why it has kept itself relevant and a key piece in the longevity of the bloc going forward. Just to share some thoughts from where I see the Pacific Alliance from where I stand, right? Like I mentioned, I work with the Pacific Alliance every day. And I can share a little bit more about Scotiabank and kind of our position in the region. So Scotia, we are a bank. We have a presence in over 33 markets, I think is our number. We employ more than 90,000 people all over the world, and we service more than 20 million customers globally. But the Americas is really our main area of focus. So one of our strategic pillars is to lead in the Americas. And the Pacific Alliance is a key part of that strategy. These 4 countries, along with Canada and the US, make up our 6 core markets, which are our largest, and where we see a big potential for growth. So this is a key piece for us in our big global strategy. These banks, and just to give you a bit of context, so Scotiabank is the 3rd largest bank in Canada by loans, and we're also the 3rd largest in Chile. We're the 5th largest in Mexico and 6th largest in Colombia. We're also 3rd in Peru. So our operation there is very significant. We see ourselves as a big part of the economic fabric in all of these countries. We always say we're very proud of our heritage and our presence in the region. Our leaders of the bank have spoken about this at great length, why the Pacific Alliance, why these markets are so attractive, and I think that you will probably share this view with me, is that these markets are demographically, they're very attractive. It's a very young population, but they're also very diversified and open economies. They're business friendly, and when you deal with the Pacific Alliance, you gain access to multiple other markets across the world. So the Pacific Alliance has excelled in signing trade agreements with different regions of the world, different countries. The economies are very diversified. The macro fundamentals are there. And for a bank, like the banking sectors are fairly well regulated and very stable. So I think that kind of speaks for itself, why we're in the Pacific Alliance. We're very proud of our presence there. And I think that the region does deserve attention. And frankly, I think it's getting it. I just look at the amount of the number of countries that are currently participating as observers in the Pacific Alliance. We have, I believe, more than 60, and one of them is Canada. I'm getting nods from. Congratulations, I think, are in order because recently the Pacific Alliance signed that trade agreement with Singapore. The alliance itself continues to progress. So I'm going to go to our panel and get some thoughts from you guys based on what I just sort of shared. Kind of our.
Hey, microphone.
Hello. Do I need to turn it on? Is that on? We're back. So based on what I saw, what I just said, Pablo, and I'm going to start with you. Kind of sharing this picture of where we're at today, kind of our current vision, where we're at today. What can you tell us about, sort of looking back as we're marking the 11th anniversary of the Alliance? Where did we come from, where we're at today, and what can you share on that note?
Thank you. Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation from the Embassy of Mexico, particularly Ms. Dulce, who moved forward the contact. My perspective would be, yes, very much as I was asked, where is it coming from? And it's important to understand where the Alianza para el Pacífico, or Pacific Alliance, is coming from. It's coming from an idea that actually started, I believe, in Peru, right, with former President Alan Garcia, who wanted to coordinate a series of Latin American countries and their interest in Pacific markets in the Pacific Rim. Not only towards Asia, but also among the countries on the Pacific Rim of Latin America. And I think in that regard, he has done really well. Yes, he has not extended to all the countries that are on the Pacific Rim in Latin America, but as it was very well said, he continues to generate a significant amount of interest. And that was the purpose, to generate interest, to underline the cohesiveness, or at least the coherence of the common interest of the four members, right? Colombia, Mexico, Peru, and Chile, in not only the interest to trade more in the Pacific, but also to maintain the policies of open markets. And for that, they undertook the strategy of open regionalism. Right? What we know from open regionalism is an idea to develop the opening of a country, right, and to articulate domestic policies towards that opening. And in that sense, I think he has been substantially successful. He has generated a series of working groups that meet annually or biannually, depending on the subject, ministerial groups, and the consistency over time. It's something that, from looking at it in the Latin American context, is quite important, and it's quite an achievement. One thing that Latin Americans, unfortunately, we are very well known for is not our consistency. And so Alianza para el Pacífico has been good to demonstrate that once the goal is set and once certain principles are agreed, that consistency can be maintained. Now, looking at the Pacific Alliance from the perspective of, normally the way we look at regional integration, regional trade integration, yes, the achievements are not substantial. I mean, there is about 3 to 6% of intra-regional trade. And of that intra-regional trade, not that much is inter-industry trade, which is the trade that is most looked for when we are thinking of deeper economic integration. However, we have to understand that the economic basis of these countries are not similar enough to have, certain levels of complementarity. Right? So that is not going to happen easily. It's going to take more time. One indicator of its success, I would say, is the growing number of observing countries. Right? It's right now, as it was said before, it has over 60, but it began with a much smaller number. And none of the ones that were observing before has dropped out. Right? So the interest in the region has been maintained. Some micro policies at the level of student exchanges, at trying to move skilled individuals across countries, have generated some traction. Right? The numbers still are relatively small compared to, for example, equivalent policies inside the European Union, but it is still a good start, particularly in the integration of Mexico with its South American partners. Mexico has not historically had as much of an open movement of people's policy as other South American countries, for example, right? So you have to keep in mind that the structure of trade of the different partners is quite different. Mexico is a country that, for the most part, specializes in manufacturing. Right? It does have extractive industries, it does have some agricultural exports. The main thing is manufacturing. And because of that, actually trades more with the Mercosur countries in Latin America than it actually trades with these Pacific Alliance members. But there is still some more policies that could direct this in a different way so that Mexico would also integrate more with these other members of the Pacific Alliance. However, we have to understand that the Pacific Alliance was conceived and remains as a rather market-driven initiative. Yes, it is an intergovernmental structure, and yes, it's very presidential driven within that. But it doesn't have compelling disciplines. It does not have a general secretary, right? It does not have a centralized bureaucracy, such think of the European Union, think of even ASEAN, right? So it's going to be quite different. I think overall, I mean, I don't want to talk too long. My first question, maybe I don't get asked anymore. But overall, I think the substance of the progress has been significant as a contribution to the general economic growth and also economic development. We know that those two terms are very different of the member countries. I do have interest about what is going to happen in the future, whether it's going to expand and whether that expansion is going to reflect in a change of its agenda, and how the changes of government that are going to happen in several of these countries, or that has happened very recently, is also going to reflect in a change of its agenda. But I leave it for now.
Thank you. Can I borrow your
Thank you, Pablo. I think those comments were, I mean, I was learning actually from those taking notes, because I'd never actually thought about the piece of the centralized, leadership and government, and I wonder if there's, a body of research, I'm sure it exists on, the pros and cons and where that would lead the alliance, one way or another. So Meredith, we're sitting in Canada. We know that Canada is an observer state. What can you tell us, based on what you've heard in this discussion? And I remember, a few years ago when there were consultations around Canada's sort of involvement with the Pacific Alliance, and a few of us were in Parliament actually providing comments about it. Where are we at today on that piece? What's the role for Canada? And especially, thinking that this idea that, we already have trade agreements with each of the Pacific Alliance countries, like where do we take it from here? And what, can be Canada's positioning, especially thinking in terms of diversification?
Thanks, Adriana. So I'm really happy to be here. I want to start it off, though, by saying I don't consider myself to be an expert on the Pacific Alliance. I consider myself to be an expert in Canadian trade, and I have spent a lot of time working on virtually all of Canada's recent trade agreements. And I've worked with all of the countries of the Pacific Alliance on individual trade issues. Most mostly Mexico, but 3 of the 4 Pacific Alliance countries are members of CPTPP, and those negotiations are relatively recent. We have FTAs with all of those countries, and so I've spent lots of time thinking about each country within the Pacific Alliance, but frankly less time thinking about the Pacific Alliance. That probably says something about me, but it also maybe says something about the state of the relationship between Canada and the Pacific Alliance in terms of what we're looking for moving forward. I am no longer a government official, so I'm giving you my thoughts as an academic, which is great because I can tell you all kinds of thoughts. Whereas when you're a government official, those of you who are either officials or have been on the other side know that at times we're a bit constrained about the things that officials can share. But I want to first start with some just very general kind of Canadian trade policy thoughts, and then come to the Pacific Alliance. So, one of the things I think we can learn from is actually Canada's relationship with the European Union and its trade agreement. So that was signed, it came into force in 2017, so we've had 5 years now of implementation. And of course, we've all been through the pandemic, which has disrupted trade for all countries in many ways. So that has had an impact. So the good news is that for two-way trade is up with the European Union, which is great. But there's a couple of things we should be keeping an eye on as Canada and as other trading blocs and regions interested in trading with Canada. So the first thing is that only about 50% of trade is falling under CETA preferences, meaning that 50% isn't. So firms are importing and exporting without using the trade preferences that were, hard negotiated, hard fought for, and now they sit there unused. So that's a problem for both sides. It's a problem both for firms, but also for governments to help with that uptake. The other thing is that I think it's important to recognize the direction of the increased trade. So European firms seem to be doing a better job trading with Canada than Canadian firms are doing at trading with Europe. My Canadian official friends in the room probably don't like it when I point that out, but I think it's important to be aware of. I don't know the reason for that, but I hypothesize that and until I learn otherwise, or until someone corrects me, I'm going around Ottawa saying that this is what I think is going on. I think that European firms, frankly, have had more time to get used to regulatory barriers of trade with other countries. They're used to trading within a very regulatory-heavy trading space in the single European market. And they have kind of figured it out. So, if you look at a European label, you'll see 8 different flags or 20 different flags, all written in different languages, because they figured all of this out. Canadian firms have been very fortunate to have the world's largest economy south of us, and so we're used to trading with the United States. We figured that out. We're very good with trading with the United States. We need to catch up in how to trade with other economies. So the reason that I think that that's important when we think about applying this to the Pacific Alliance is that I think it's necessary for the greater the Pacific Alliance integrates its own economy, integrates its own rules, deals with regulatory barriers, deals with various technical barriers to trade, the more attractive it becomes as a region for a country like Canada, who's looking at, well, where do we go next? Yes, we have trade agreements in place individually with each country. Yes, we have CPTPP in place with 3 or 4 countries. But there's still lots of barriers to trade, and Canadian firms need to learn how to do that. And so for the Pacific Alliance to be attractive to Canada, I think the more regional integration that happens, the better. And then another piece of that that's, I think, important to bear in mind